Does anybody need any help with that?
No.
Okay. Okay. So let's look at our notes here tonight. And I want to do this review. If you go to page 16, and on page 16, the first thing I want to focus on is on page 16, the first Galilean tour at the bottom of page 16. So you have to know this, that the first Galilean tour, Jesus went throughout all Galilee. And who could read Mark chapter 1, verse 39, please? Mark chapter 1, verse 39. I'm going to ask you to read it and get it, and just read it out. Whoever has it, go for it.
Mark 1:39, Pastor.
Yes.
Mark 1:39, and he preached in their synagogues throughout all Galilee and cast out devils.
Okay, so in his first Galilean tour, what I really want you to remember, if you look even on the next page, as he went around healing, casting out demons, and it's in this first Galilean tour that his Sermon on the Mount is given in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. So that was probably the essence of his preaching during his first Galilean tour. So we've talked about that. Okay, so that's what I want you to know about his first Galilean tour. And it was with the disciples. Remember, they were not apostles. I also want you to keep that in mind. They had not yet been called apostles, but the disciples were with him. So then we see his second tour, his second Galilean tour, and this is on page number 17, his second Galilean tour. That's right in the middle of the page, letter F, where it says Jesus returns to Capernaum and then makes his second tour around Galilee. So turn here, please, to Luke chapter 8, verse 1. Luke chapter 8, verse 1. And Micah, could you please read Luke chapter 8, verse 1?
And it came to pass afterward that he went throughout every city and village, preaching and showing the glad tidings of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him. Okay,
so during this tour, the disciples have been called, and now they're apostles. So that's a difference between his first and second Galilean tour. Then in his second Galilean tour, he introduces the parabolic method. So we see that in Luke chapter 8, beginning at verse 4 and following. Now, I will say this, I'm trying to piece the chronology of the life of Christ together, and it's somewhat difficult. Different gospels have different orders, but I believe Luke has the right order here in that he says he goes throughout Galilee, and then the parabolic method of teaching is really introduced. So in his second tour, what I want you to remember is that the disciples are called apostles. And if you need to mute yourself, maybe you could do that if you do need to mute yourself. Okay, so does somebody should mute themselves because I do hear some feedback there. Okay. All right. So then in his third tour, his third Galilean tour. Okay, I'm going to have to start.
What was it on?
I think it's the 718 phone number, Pastor.
I don't really know how to do it here. I'm not, I thought I could do it.
I hear Jeffrey. Huh?
Okay. So if you can mute yourself, I would appreciate that, guys out there. I'm having a little trouble controlling that piece of it. Okay. So in his third tour, and here's a picture of Bethsaida, which is where he fed the 5,000. And if you look, please, on page 18 in your notes, his third tour around Galilee. Now, what makes this tour unique is it's kind of, this is probably his longest tour because he tours with the disciples. In Matthew chapter 9, we see this, his third tour. In Matthew chapter 9, if you look please at verse number 35, and Ellie, could you please read Matthew chapter 9, verse 35?
Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people.
Okay, so, and then if you look in Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, what does Jesus do now? So he went about all the villages, and then in verse 1, what does he do? He commissions his 12 to go around and do a tour. So he tours with them, and now he sends them out. And if you look, please, in Matthew chapter 11, verse 1, Scott, if you could read Matthew chapter 11, verse 1.
Yeah. And it came to pass when Jesus had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, he departed thence to teach and to preach in their cities.
Okay, so what makes this unique now, he tours with the disciples, then he sends out the disciples, and then when the disciples are out touring, it says here, after he commanded his disciples, he went and began to preach in the city. So maybe one is with him, we don't really know, but the disciples are going out and Jesus is going out at the same time. So now the effort of evangelism, if you will, is being multiplied. So those are his 3 Galilean tours. So I want you to know that. Now, I want to also focus, I want you to remember the two events that culminated his Galilean ministry. And the 2 events that culminated his Galilean ministry, the first one is at the bottom of page 19. And what is that? What event culminated, was the pinnacle where he was really bringing the disciples to do what? In Matthew chapter 16. And where was that? Matthew and page 19 in your notes.
Caesarea Philippi.
Okay, right, in Caesarea Philippi. So find this on map 109. If you see Caesarea Philippi, it's in this Galantius area. It's in the north. It's right through, you see the double red arrows, and that's right where Caesarea Philippi is. And under Caesarea Philippi, it says, what does it say under Caesarea Philippi, Micah?
Sorry, I'm not there yet.
Oh, okay. Well, it's on your screen. It should be right on the screen. If you can find Caesarea Philippi. Or who does it? Bailey, you see that?
Yes, Peter's great confession.
No, I'm sorry. Under Caesarea Philippi, on the map, look in the map. I'm sorry, I'm not explaining myself properly. On the map, the Paneas.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Paneas. So why Paneas? Because it was the cave. They worshiped the god of Pan there for many years. And so we talked about Caesarea Philippi. And what did we say? And I want you to read this, and I want you to know this on top of page 20 about the city. It was initially called Paneas. It was renamed Caesarea Philippi to honor Caesar by Philip, the son of Herod the Great. But Herod the Great had built a temple in honor of Caesar before that. And that's a picture of the temple as it may have looked. And then these are the ruins as they are now in Caesarea Philippi. And we talked about this cave, very deep, dark. It's where people came to worship the underworld. It was considered the gate of the spiritual underworld. And I think this is one of the most interesting things I've found in the study of Bible geography, is that it was called the gate of hell. And no wonder Jesus said that these gates of hell will not prevail against his church when he brought his disciples to Caesarea Philippi. So there's the mouth of that gate of hell. And here is a picture of it. And of course, we also said that this area was a primary source for the water of the Jordan River. So this is Caesarea Philippi. So really his ministry culminated there when he brought the disciples. They said, "Thou art the Christ." And from that point on, he began to teach them that he has come to die. Matthew chapter 16. And if you can look at that, that's a turning point in the Gospel of Matthew, verse 21. From that time forth, Jesus began to show to his disciples how he must go to Jerusalem, suffer and be killed and be raised from the dead. So that was a real turning point when he brought them here to Caesarea Philippi. The other major event in his Galilean ministry, even though these two events, at least this one didn't happen in Galilee, it was still while he was finishing up his Galilean ministry, was the what? And this is on page number 20, number 12. What's the second event that culminated his Galilean ministry?
Is transfiguration.
The Mount of Transfiguration. Think of how significant that was. Even Peter wrote about it in 2 Peter chapter 1 later on, where he says, we were eyewitnesses of his majesty when we heard from that holy mountain God himself speak. So now there's two possible areas that the Mount of Transfiguration took place. One is Mount Hermon, and you could see that on the map here, and it's above, north of Caesarea Philippi. So if you go north of Caesarea Philippi, a little bit east, you see Mount Hermon, and it says there on your screen, possible site of Jesus's transfiguration. And that's map number 109. Do you all see that?
Yes, Pastor.
Okay, so that's one of the areas. What was the other possible area where the transfiguration may have taken place? Do you remember?
Mount Tabor.
Mount Tabor.
Yeah, Mount Tabor. So this is Mount Hermon. It's a much larger mountain. It's a series of mountains, a mountain range. But and some believe that it was there, but others believe it was Mount Tabor, which was actually in Galilee. So find Mount Tabor, and here's another picture of Mount Tabor. It's just west of the Sea of Galilee, and here's a picture. And Mount Tabor, find the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, the southernmost part of the Sea of Galilee, and then just go across west. And even before you come to Nazareth, go a little south, and you'll see Mount Tabor right through the red line there on that map. That's also map 109. You all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that's Mount Tabor. So now look at your book, and he has a comment about these two areas in your book. If you look, please, in your book on page 223, and it's on the second column, the very top paragraph of the second column. Do you find that? Can you find that? And I'm going to ask Brother Scott, could you please read, maybe start at the paragraph right at the bottom of that first column where it says at Caesarea Philippi. Could you read that and then just read that next section at the top of that column, page 223?
Yep. At Caesarea Philippi, Jesus queried his disciples about his true identity, eliciting Simon Peter's response, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Still the foundational Christian confession of faith found in Matthew 16:16. The transfiguration of Jesus probably took place in Philip's land also. Tradition located this event on Mount Tabor in eastern Jezreel, but most scholars favor the slopes of Mount Hermon as the more likely setting.
Okay, so he prefers Mount Hermon. I saw others who prefer Mount Tabor. So, take your pick. I kind of think conservative, Bible-believing Christians lean towards Mount Tabor myself, but I'm not an expert in it. Micah, do you know about that?
I don't know about it. The one thing I do know about Mount Tabor, which is kind of cool, is, Deborah and Barak were there, and Tabor is another kind of pronunciation of Deborah, possibly. So I lean toward Mount Tabor as well.
Yeah, I do as well. And, the thing is like if he was on the top of this mountain, there was only one place he could have been, because there's the mountain. It's not a range of mountains. It's one mountain, and it's in Galilee. So I think that's significant. This kind of is like the culmination of his Galilean ministry, the transfiguration. So these are the two events that culminated his Galilean ministry. So know that. And then just generally, I want you to, now we're going to go back just to page 18. Know that on the feeding of the 5,000, it took place outside of the city of where? What city did the feeding of the 5,000 take place? Outside the city of what? Of where?
Bethsaida.
Bethsaida. And how many baskets were collected after the feeding of 5,000?
12.
12. So I want you to know that. And 12, we actually looked at this last Wednesday. I believe it's significant. 12 is a number of authority. So Jesus Christ is establishing his authority with the disciples. He's the Christ. He is the King of Israel. The 12 tribes. He's the king of the church. He's the Lord of the church. And then 12 is the number of heaven with the 12 gates and the 12 foundation stones and the 12 manners of fruits. Jesus is the King of kings and the Lord of lords of heaven, the light of heaven. So he is the authority. And so that's what 12 represents to the disciples. Okay, then I want you to know page 109. This is one of my favorite geographic nuances in the gospel, is given actually by Mark when he tells how Jesus, he went up into Tyre and Sidon. And so do you see this map? Again, map number 109, where he left Capernaum area. In the red line, you follow it all the way up to Tyre. You see that on this, you see Tyre on the western shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Jesus went there. Who did he meet up there? Who did he help and heal? And this is on page 19 in your notes, and it's point number 7 and 8. Who did he help? Who did he meet?
Syrophoenician woman.
Right, remember that? And she said, Lord, just a crumb from your table is good enough for me. When he called her a Gentile dog, she said, yes, Lord, I am a Gentile, but I'll eat a crumb. That's one of the most faithful statements in all the Bible, humbling statement. So, but I thought it was very interesting. Mark tells us he doesn't just go straight back to the Sea of Galilee. Remember what he did? He goes all the way around, and he comes back toward the Sea of Galilee from the eastern side. And all along the way, I believe he's healing people, and it tells a number of different things. But then it's over here that Jesus feeds who? He feeds not the 5,000, but he feeds the 4,000, probably in this area of Gergesi or somewhere in this area of Decapolis in the light green. That's Decapolis, and you could see that also on your map 109. Now here, how many baskets, of course, did they were left? Did they collect at the end of the feeding? A miracle, not 12, but 7. Why 7? 7, is that a significant number in the Bible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Probably a more significant number to Gentile people. So 7 is that number of perfection, the number of completion. So you should know that he fed the 4,000 in this Gergesenes area, and he fed the 4,000, 7 baskets left. Okay, so that's what we need to know there. Then we looked at the final feast of Jesus last week, and we said the 2 final feasts on page 21, before he finishes his he's finishing up his ministry in Galilee. He goes to Jerusalem for 2 feasts. What were those 2 feasts on page 21? What were those 2 feasts?
Feast of Tabernacle.
Okay, the Feast of Tabernacles, and then the Feast of Dedication. Okay. Oh, Jennifer, is that Jennifer? Maybe she might not know how to mute. I don't know why I was having trouble. Hi, Jennifer. How you doing, sister? Okay.
After, so Adrian,
Yeah? No, somebody else. Yeah. Somebody else.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, Johnny, real quick. It's the phone number. It's the 718-395-1920. If you put your cursor over the phone, it should give you the option to be able to mute it, Pastor. And I texted them, so I'm not sure why they're not seeing the information.
but Adrian said Pastor can also have a control. So I don't know. He said
I know. I'm trying to.
You have the list of participants, and it will highlight like the mic, and you can actually press it to mute them.
I know. I've done that before.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. Chat, merge with audio. What does that mean? I'm sorry to be doing this. I don't know. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm not figuring this out. So we'll just trust the Lord. Okay. So let me go back to that.
If it were my phone, I could have done something. Really? But my phone does not have speaker.
You know, I don't know if she hears. Jennifer, do you hear us? You know, maybe she doesn't hear us.
You're telling you? I think not. Maybe she doesn't realize he's there. Oh, I saw him.
I'm sorry, guys. Okay. You know what?
Can you see this a little bit? Mm-hmm. So nice. It's so nice to them.
Okay.
He doesn't have hair. Oh, how nice he was when he had hair. I've been removed, you know, from this meeting by the host.
I don't know what's going on. I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure this out. I'm sorry. I'm still learning, obviously, how to do this. Okay, here we go. So what I want to say now is after the feast, these two feasts, look at John chapter 10. Look at John chapter 10. Look at verse 40, please. I believe that after the Feast of Dedication, in John chapter 10 and verse number 40, notice what it says there, and who could read that for us, please? Anna, do you have that, please? Anna Landonio, John chapter 10 and verse number 40.
And went away again beyond the Jordan into the place where John at first baptized, and there he abode.
Okay, so my understanding is that after the Feast of Dedication, he did not return to Galilee. He stayed in this region, and notice the description here. It says he went away beyond Jordan. So he went to the other side of the Jordan River from where Jerusalem, so see Jerusalem, go on the other side of Jordan, that area where he had been baptized. And it says, there he abode. In other words, that's where he took up his residence. So that's where he lived in that area. And that area is Perea. So now we get into the Perean ministry of Jesus Christ. So also now look at Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19. So if you turn in your notes to page 22, and in Matthew chapter 19, verse 1, and let's see, who's got that verse for us? Kerry, do you have Matthew chapter 19, verse 1, please?
Matthew chapter 19, 1, and it says, and it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came into the coast of Judea beyond Jordan.
Okay, so notice that. He came into the coast, he departed Galilee, and he came into the coast of Judea beyond Jordan. So that's the description of Perea. And Mark has a similar, we won't look up Mark, but if you look at your notes on page 22, the final months, Matthew 19:1, Mark 10:1, and John, you might want to please put there John chapter 10, verse 40. Can you do that? The verse that we read from John, where it says where he abode. So that's where I believe he abode in the last few months of his ministry. And Luke calls this, or we call this, the Perean ministry of Jesus Christ. So now we focused in on this last week. Now what I want you to do, take your Bible, you open up your Bible to Luke, please, in chapter number 10. And I want you to just kind of look through some of these chapters, kind of like survey them. And we want to see just some of the unique features of Luke's gospel, because the Perean ministry of Jesus given in Luke is really the unique aspect of Luke's gospel. So in Luke chapter 10, what do we read about in verse 1? What do we read about?
The 70.
Yeah, the appointing of the 70. No other gospel gives that record of the appointing of the 70. So that's in Luke 10. And then we have this famous story, one of the most famous stories of all time. And it's chapter 10. And it's in verse 33. It's in the middle of it. But what's that the story of? We call that the story of who?
The Good Samaritan.
The Good Samaritan. No other gospel has that story, only Luke. In Luke chapter 11, we have certain parables unique to Luke. In Luke chapter 11, we have the Lord's Prayer. And then we also have this parable we call the parable of the friend at midnight in Luke chapter 11, verse 5. And then the parable of the Pharisee and the publican in verse number, Luke chapter 11, and down a little bit. Actually, you know what? Did I have the wrong chapter on that? Anyway, forget that one. In Luke chapter 12, there's a famous parable. And what is this the parable of? Look in Luke chapter 12, verse 20. Luke chapter 12, verse 20. We call that the parable of who? The
Rich fool.
The rich fool. Yeah. So only Luke has that. In Luke chapter 13, there's the woman who was healed of a spirit of infirmity, who was bound by Satan. Luke chapter 13 and verse number 8 down through verse 17 or so. So that's in Luke 13. In Luke 14, Jesus gives a discourse on discipleship. And in verse 26 and following, he says 3 times, if you don't hate your life, you cannot be my disciple. If you don't take your cross, you cannot be my disciple. So that's a unique teaching on discipleship. In Luke 15, of course, is the parable of what?
In Luke what? Sorry.
Luke 15. Luke 15.
Lost sheep.
Okay, it's really one parable in 3 parts, right? The lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, the parable of lost things. So you can say there are 3 parables if you like. Some people say there were 1. But anyway, so that's absolutely unique to Luke also. Obviously, I mean, these are some of those famous stories known to man, right? The prodigal son. Only Luke has it in this spot in the gospel, in the Bible, Luke chapter 15. So, and then in Luke 16, we have the parable of the unjust steward, and we of course have the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Absolutely unique to Luke in Luke chapter 16. In Luke chapter 17 is the healing of the 10 lepers. Absolutely unique to Luke. In Luke chapter 18 is the parable of the unjust judge. Absolutely unique to Luke. And then in Luke chapter 19, verse 1, who comes to Jesus and climbs the tree?
Zacchaeus.
Zacchaeus. Only Luke has Zacchaeus. So these are all absolutely unique to Luke. Luke's gospel is just as unique as almost John, and each gospel, of course, is independently written by the inspiration of God. So that's a little bit of the Perean ministry of Jesus Christ. This all comes out of the Perean ministry. So here's what I want to say now. Remember how we talked about the 3 different Galilean tours? They have the different elements of the Sermon on the Mount, the parabolic teaching, and the sending of the disciples. The Perean ministry has all those elements. In other words, look in your notes what we did last week. And here's all the blanks, by the way. Whoops, sorry. Okay, so this is page 22. If you weren't here last week, these are all the blanks. Does anyone need blanks? So what's on this page? What did we say about the Perean ministry last week? He gave famous narrative stories. Luke writes about many what? Parables. Number 4, Jesus performed great
Miracles.
Number 5, he had a lot of important teachings, or we call them what? Discourses. And he sent out the 70
on a mission.
So all of the elements of the Galilean ministry were in the Perean ministry. The parables, and actually the Sermon on the Mount type teaching is in Luke chapter 12. Luke's Sermon on the Mount, if you will, is in Luke 12. So I found that interesting that all the Galilean ministry elements were there. And not sending the 12, though, sending the 70. Okay. Any questions so far?
Not a question, but a comment. Can everybody Can you guys mute yourselves? There's like major background noise.
I know.
I don't know who that's coming from, but please, it's very difficult to follow. Thank you. Sorry, Pastor.
No, thank you for saying it. I was trying to, I'm sorry I didn't have better control of the class. I'm going to call Adrian in between and ask how to mute everybody if I need to do that, because I'm not certain how to do it. Okay, so look on the top of page 23, please. Now here is Bethany, a nice picture that I found of Bethany. This was the home. Who lived in Bethany?
Mary, Martha, and Lazarus.
Exactly. They lived there. And here's another. This other picture is of Bethany, an ancient picture of Bethany. And in John, chapter 11, and this is where I kind of overlooked this last week. John chapter 11. John chapter 11, and please look at verse 47. Let's see here. 54, verse 54 of John chapter 11. And Raul, do you have it? Are you following along with us okay down there, brother? Do you have John chapter 11, verse 54?
I do, Pastor. Sorry, I had muted it. God bless you all. John 11, I'm sorry, Pastor, verse 57?
54.
I'm sorry, verse 54. Jesus therefore walked no more openly among the Jews, but went thence unto a country near to the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there continued with his disciples.
There we go. Somehow I don't know why I was clicking that button before, it wasn't muting, and I just did it and it muted. I don't understand. Technology is crazy. Okay, so where does it say they went? Where does it say here, after Jesus raised up Lazarus, where did he go? Into the city of
Ephraim.
Ephraim. And if you look on page, your map 111, see if I could get that for you. You see Ephraim on map 11? It's north of Jerusalem, straight north. Oh, there it is. So if you look at Jerusalem and look at the green line going straight north, and you see where it says Ephraim, and there's a white box there. It says Jesus withdraws to Ephraim to avoid plots upon his life. So it's another area that he went during his Perean ministry. He went up into Ephraim. He also stayed in Bethany, and he was also on the other side of the Jordan. So if you could make a note of that somewhere in your notes, that in his Perean ministry, 3 areas where he was 1, Bethany. I'm writing this down. 2, Ephraim. And 3, on the east of the Jordan. Okay, so those 3 areas are 3 geographic areas where Jesus was. Okay.
Pastor, can you repeat that one more time? Ephraim.
Bethany.
And east of Jordan.
And east of Jordan, and
Yeah.
where it says in John chapter 10, where he abode in the area where John baptized, somewhere around Bethabara, I believe. Okay, so now, the 3 travel passages, we hit on that last week, but I want you to know these 3 travel passages. So let's go to them again. Luke chapter 9, 51, Luke 13, 22, and Luke 17, 11. Okay, so look at Luke 9, 51. Okay, and Scott, do you have that verse for us, please?
I'm sorry, it was Luke 9 and what verse?
51.
51, got it. And it came to pass when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem.
Okay, so here he steadfastly set his face, and then the next story tells of him going to Samaria where he is going to be rejected. Now just think of this. Remember he had gone to Samaria earlier and the whole town came out to him. They received him. The Samaritan woman believed, but now he goes through Samaria, they reject him. So he is despised and rejected of men. He has been rejected by the Jewish establishment. He has been cast out of Nazareth twice. When he went to Gadara, he healed the man with the legion of demons, and they begged him to leave. Remember that? And now Samaria rejects him. So he is greatly rejected throughout his life. Now go to Luke chapter 13, please. Luke chapter 13. And Bailey, could you read that verse for us, please? Luke chapter 13 and verse number 22.
And he went through the cities and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem.
Okay, so what goes in that blank number 2 there? We filled it in last week. He went through the
Cities
and villages. So first he went through Samaria. Now he's going through the cities and villages on his journey from Galilee down to Perea. And the journey there is given to us on map 110. On map 110. Which is here. Okay, so he's going through Samaria, he's journeying, and then going over there into Perea as well. And then Luke chapter 17, verse 11 is the third travel passage in Luke. These are difficult to harmonize because it seems like Jesus is not getting anywhere. Because Luke 17:11 almost puts him back in Galilee, and it looks like he's starting his journey over again. So in Luke 17:11, it says, and it came to pass as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. So this has created some consternation in the harmonizing of these passages, because in Luke 9:51, it says that he was leaving Galilee. In Luke, that first verse, it says he was steadfastly set his face to Jerusalem. In Luke 17, he's still going through Galilee. See what I'm saying? So how to exactly harmonize these have been difficult. But the point of these, we said, is the main emphasis of these verses is that he's going where? What's Luke's focus? That Jesus is going where?
Jerusalem.
To Jerusalem. And that ultimately then, the chronology becomes more clear when we get into Luke 18, that the journey took him, letter B, we said, was through where? Jericho. And then finally he approached and he arrived where in letter C? In Jerusalem. Okay? So now, how to harmonize these three passages is difficult. Hendrickson, in his commentary, has an interesting discussion to harmonize this problem. And he proposes three possibilities. Number one, they may describe three separate trips that Jesus made from north to south. And a scholar named A.T. Robertson holds to this. So letter A is three separate trips. Okay, you got that?
Excuse me, sir. Are you talking about in the middle of page 23? B?
No, I'm talking about at the bottom of page 23, letter A. This is a blank now. You didn't fill that in. This is a new blank. The bottom of page 23, letter A, where it says that these three separate journeys. You have all the other blanks filled in, right, Ellie?
No.
What blanks do you have missed?
I need all of them. I'm sorry. I think I must have missed it. A, 1, 2, 3.
Oh, wow. Do you have those blanks filled in? Does anyone have those blanks?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so A is Jerusalem.
Okay, I got it. Okay. 1.
1 is Samaria.
Okay.
2 is cities and villages.
3.
Galilee and Samaria.
Okay, thank you.
B is through Jericho. You have that?
Yes.
C is Jerusalem. At the bottom of page 23, letter A, 3 separate trips. So what Robertson is proposing is that these 3 verses are 3 journeys from Galilee to Jerusalem. That's what he's saying. So, and then these are the possible verses from John, and he correlates the Luke verses with John verses. We're not going to look them up. It's not really part of, but it's to me, it's interesting, so I have it included. But I will read this. You're with me on the top of page 24? It says, Christ journeyed to Jerusalem to attend the Feast of Tabernacles. In John 7 corresponds to Luke chapter 9, verse 51. So Robertson says that could have been the first journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. Then he says, number 2, Jesus's trip to Bethany to raise Lazarus from the dead in John 11 corresponds to the journey in Luke 13. And then he says, Jesus is coming to Jerusalem to attend the final Passover in John 12 corresponds to Luke 17, verse 11. So he says 3 separate journeys. Now, I don't believe that view, and I'll tell you why, but it's interesting. Some say, letter B, they don't know. They don't even try to figure it out. Some have actually lost their faith over this, believe it or not. So, some people, they smack up against the difficulties of harmonizing the 4 Gospels, and they think there's contradictions. No, there's no contradictions. There might be things hard for us to understand, but the Bible does not contradict itself. Letter C, I believe it is best to say that these 3 references all indicate the same journey. That's letter C. That's your blank there. They all indicate the same journey of Jesus from Capernaum via Perea, ultimately through Jericho to Jerusalem. And what Hendrickson actually in his commentary argues, and I agree with him, is that Luke is not concerned primarily with giving a chronological order of events. So that's number 1, that's the blank there. Luke is not concerned with giving a chronological order of events, but is telling forth the teaching and the working of Jesus as he was heading toward Jerusalem. And the reason I went through all of these different chapters before in Luke is to say that he could have done these anywhere. He could have taught the parables of the friend at midnight, or the Pharisee and the publican, or the rich fool, or he could have given his discourse of discipleship and the parable of lost things, and the teaching of the rich man and Lazarus, and the healing of the 10 lepers was obviously in Samaria. So it's not chronological, but just things he did on his journey as he was journeying from Galilee to Perea in his Perean ministry. So number 2, I would say there does not seem to be enough time for Jesus to accomplish all that Luke writes in John chapter 7, verses 1 through 13. So in other words, I'm saying that if it's 3 separate journeys, and in Luke 9:51, it corresponds to Jesus traveling to Jerusalem for this Feast of Tabernacles, it just doesn't seem there would be enough time for him to do everything in that one journey. Because in John, it's just very quick. He just left and he got there very quickly in the middle of the feast. He waited to go to the feast, and then he arrived at the feast in the middle or so. So there's not enough time for him for all these other things to take place. And also what I said earlier, from my take on this in the chronology, is in John chapter 10, verse 40, after the Feast of Dedication, Jesus went over to Perea and he stayed there. So once he went down to the Feast of Dedication, he did not go back to Galilee. So that's kind of my position on it. But again, we could agree, different men hold to different things on this. Okay, then number 3. Ultimately, Jesus is telling us that Luke tells us that Jesus is going to Jerusalem. That's the blank on number 3. Luke is focusing us that Jesus is going to Jerusalem to take the cross, to die for our sins, and to rise again the 3rd day. That's really behind everything Jesus is doing. And then number 4, Luke returns to Jesus's departure from Galilee 3 times in those 3 travel passages. And I want you to know them. And I want you to know them, the order of them. Like the first one, he went through Samaria. The second one, he went through cities and villages. The third one, he went through Galilee and Samaria. And Luke returns to those 3 times, amplifying to us the importance of that moment. That's the last blank for this class now. Number 4, the blank is the importance of that moment in Christ's earthly ministry, showing that he goes to Jerusalem, that he leaves Galilee. That was significant because he had basically done his whole earthly ministry there for 3 years, but now he's leaving Galilee, cutting that tie, going to Jerusalem for the feast, and then over to Perea for this Perean ministry. Okay? All right. So do you have any questions before we close tonight? You can unmute yourself if you have any questions and ask.